Ron Howard heard the crash before he saw it. His lead actor hit the warehouse floor instead of the crash pad, and the stunt coordinator's voice came through the headset in a tone Ron had never heard in 20 years of directing. Notice the exact second Ron's hand moves toward the talkback button, because the choice he makes before the medics even arrive will follow him for the rest of this production, and maybe longer. The actor's name was Marcus Chen, 34 years old. Former theater kid from Seattle, who'd spent a decade doing small roles before landing this film, the biggest of his career. He was supposed to fall backward off a 15-foot platform onto a stack of crash pads, designed to absorb exactly that kind of impact. Ron had watched the stunt coordinator, a veteran named Jack Riley, set up this exact fall 6 times in rehearsal. 6 times Marcus had hit the pads perfectly. 6 times he'd bounced up laughing, ready to do it again. But take 7 was different. Take 7 was the one that counted, and take 7 was the one where something went wrong. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? Because wherever you are, I need you to understand what it feels like to watch a man fall through the air, and know in that horrible slow motion second before impact, that he's not going to land where he's supposed to. The warehouse they'd converted into a soundstage was massive. Old brick walls that still smelled faintly of motor oil and rust. Exposed steel beams crisscrossing 40 feet overhead. The kind of industrial space that looked incredible on camera, but echoed every sound like a canyon. Thick power cables snaked across the concrete floor like black rivers, and the air was heavy with the particular smell of film sets everywhere, a mixture of sawdust, fresh paint, electrical heat, and the coffee that someone was always brewing somewhere just out of sight. When Marcus hit the concrete floor 3 feet to the left of the crash pads, the sound traveled through the entire building like a gunshot. It wasn't the soft thud of a body hitting foam. It was something harder. Something wrong, something that made every single person in that warehouse stop breathing for exactly 1 second. Ron felt it in his chest before his brain even processed what had happened. Here's the first thing I need you to hold on to. Why did Marcus miss the crash pads? I'll tell you, but first you need to understand what was happening on that set, in the hours before everything went wrong. The production was behind schedule, not a little behind. 3 days behind, which on a $40 million film meant the studio was already making calls, already asking questions, already threatening to send someone to help Ron manage things more efficiently. The pressure had been building for weeks like a slow leak in a tire. Every morning started with a phone call from the line producer, reminding Ron how much each hour cost, $14,000. Give or take for every 60 minutes the cameras weren't rolling. Every evening ended with Ron staring at the schedule, trying to figure out how to make up time without cutting corners that mattered. And every night he'd lie awake wondering if this would be the production where everything finally fell apart. Stop for a second and picture this warehouse from above, because the geography of what happened matters more than you might think. The platform where Marcus was supposed to fall from was at the north end of the building, 15 feet up, accessible by a metal staircase that the art department had dressed to look like part of an abandoned factory. The crash pads were directly below, or they should have been. But between rehearsal and the actual take, something had shifted. Maybe a crew member bumped the pads while moving equipment. Maybe the pads themselves had settled differently under their own weight. Maybe it was just one of those terrible accidents that happen when 100 people are working in a space, and nobody notices that something moved 3 feet to the right. Listen closely now, because we're 6 hours away from the studio's hard deadline on this location. 6 hours to get the shots Ron needs, or the production loses access to this warehouse and has to rebuild the entire set somewhere else at a cost that would end careers. Jack Riley's voice came through Ron's headset again, sharper this time. Ron, he's not moving. I need medical on set right now. Ron was already moving before Jack finished talking, pulling off his headset and pushing through the cluster of crew members who had frozen in place around the monitors. Everyone freezes the first time they see something go wrong on set. It's instinct. Your brain needs a second to accept that the thing you just witnessed actually happened. But Ron had been doing this long enough that his freeze lasted less than a second. One heartbeat of shock, then motion. Wait. Because what Ron sees when he reaches Marcus is going to change everything about how this day unfolds. Marcus was lying on his side, his left arm bent at an angle that arms aren't supposed to bend. His eyes were open, which was somehow worse than if they'd been closed. He was looking at Ron with an expression that mixed pain and confusion, and something else, embarrassment, maybe, like he was apologizing for ruining the take. "Don't move," Ron said, kneeling beside him. "Just stay still. Help is coming." He could hear Jack Riley shouting for the on-set medic, could hear the first AD calling for everyone to clear the area, could hear the distant wail of a siren that meant someone had already called for an ambulance. The warehouse echoed with the sound of controlled panic, people moving fast but trying not to run, voices tight with fear but trying to stay professional. 5 hours and 45 minutes until the location deadline. Ron pushed that thought away as soon as it appeared. Remember this detail, because it becomes important later. Marcus's stunt double, a man named Diego Vargas, was standing at the edge of the crowd with his hands pressed against his face. Diego was supposed to do the fall. That was the original plan. But Marcus had insisted on doing it himself. He'd trained for weeks, practiced the fall dozens of times, convinced everyone that he could handle it, and Ron had let him. Ron had signed off on the actor doing his own stunt because the shot would be better, because you could see Marcus's face the whole way down, because it would make the movie more real. One choice, one signature, one moment that Ron would replay in his mind for months afterward. The medic arrived. A woman named Sandra, who'd been working film sets for 15 years and had seen worse than this, though not by much. She moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had trained herself not to panic, her medical bag already open before she reached Marcus's side. She knelt beside him and started asking questions in that measured clinical voice that medical professionals use when they're trying to assess damage without scaring anyone. "Can you feel your fingers? Can you wiggle your toes? Where does it hurt the most? On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is the pain right now?" Marcus answered in fragments, his voice thin and strained, each word coming out like it cost him something. His arm was definitely broken. Sandra could see that without even touching it. Maybe his collarbone too, based on the way he was holding his shoulder. She couldn't rule out internal injuries without getting him to a hospital, and she said as much to Ron, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Before we go any further, you need to understand something about Ron Howard that most people don't know. He started in this business as a child actor. By the time he was directing his first film, he'd spent more years on sets than most people spend in any single career. He'd seen accidents before. He'd seen people get hurt, but he'd never been the one responsible. Not like this. Not with his signature on the form that said yes, let the actor do his own stunt." The ambulance arrived 11 minutes after the fall. Ron watched them load Marcus onto a stretcher with practiced efficiency. Watched them strap him in and check his vitals one more time. Watched them carry him out of the warehouse and into the back of the vehicle. The paramedics moved with the kind of speed that suggested urgency without panic. Professional urgency. The kind that said, "This is serious, but we've got it under control." Ron watched the doors close and the lights start flashing red and white against the brick walls of the warehouse. Watched the ambulance pull away and turn the corner and disappear from view. The siren faded into the distance, growing quieter and quieter until it was just a memory of sound, and then the warehouse was quiet. 87 crew members standing in silence, looking at each other, looking at Ron, waiting for someone, anyone, to tell them what happened next. Notice who speaks first, because it tells you everything about the pressure Ron was under. It wasn't Jack Riley. It wasn't the first AD. It was Daniel Morrison, the line producer, a man whose entire job was to make sure the film stayed on budget and on schedule. Daniel walked up to Ron with his phone already in his hand and said, "We've got 5.5 hours left on this location. What's the plan?" Ron looked at him for a long moment, without saying anything. Around them, the crew was starting to move again. Grips checking equipment, electricians adjusting lights, everyone finding something to do with their hands, because standing still felt impossible. The crash pads were still there on the floor, slightly askew, a 3-foot gap between them and the spot where Marcus had landed. Someone would have to move them. Someone would have to reset for another take. Someone would have to stand on that platform and fall again. Hold this moment in your mind, because when we come back to it at the end, you won't see Ron the same way. Daniel was still waiting for an answer. 5 hours and 23 minutes until the deadline. $40 million on the line. A lead actor in an ambulance heading to the hospital, and Ron Howard standing in the middle of a warehouse, trying to figure out what kind of director he wanted to be. "Get Diego," Ron said finally. "Tell him to get into costume." Daniel's face shifted into something like relief. Good. Good. We can still make this work. If we move fast, we can get the fall, get the coverage, and be out of here by "I'm not done," Ron said. "Get Diego into costume. Then get Jack over here. We're going to figure out what went wrong before anyone else goes up on that platform." The next 45 minutes were some of the most tense of Ron's career. He stood at the base of the platform with Jack Riley, going over every element of the stunt setup with the kind of attention to detail that most people reserve for surgery. They checked the crash pads, all 12 of them, one by one. They checked the platform itself, looking for anything that might have caused Marcus to fall at the wrong angle. They checked the rigging, the safety lines, the backup systems that were supposed to catch anyone who missed the pads. And they found it. A small thing, a stupid thing. One of the guide wires that was supposed to help control the angle of the fall had come loose from its anchor point. Not completely loose, just enough that it didn't provide the resistance it was supposed to. Just enough that Marcus's trajectory shifted 3 feet to the left. Listen to this carefully, because it's the part that kept Ron awake for weeks afterward. The guide wire had been checked that morning. Jack Riley had personally inspected every element of the rig before rehearsal. But somewhere between the final rehearsal and the actual take, a gap of maybe 90 minutes while they reset cameras and adjusted lighting, something had happened. The anchor had slipped. Nobody noticed. And a man was in an ambulance now because of a failure that was measured in millimeters. 4 hours and 38 minutes until the deadline. Ron had a choice to make. Wait, because the choice isn't what you think it is. This isn't a story about whether to continue filming. Of course they were going to continue filming. They had to. The real choice was about something else entirely. Diego Vargas was standing at the base of the platform in full costume, looking up at the 15-foot drop with an expression that Ron recognized. It was the look of a professional who knew his job and was ready to do it, but who had also just watched someone else get carried away on a stretcher doing the exact same thing. Diego wasn't afraid. Stunt performers can't afford to be afraid. But he was aware, deeply, viscerally aware that the crash pads below him had failed to catch his colleague less than an hour ago. Ron walked over to him. "How are you feeling?" Diego shrugged, a gesture that managed to convey both confidence and uncertainty at the same time. "I've done this fall 100 times. I know what went wrong. Jack fixed it. I'm ready." "That's not what I asked," Ron said. "I asked how you're feeling." Diego was quiet for a moment. Around them the crew was resetting for the next attempt. Lights were being adjusted. Cameras were being positioned. The machine of filmmaking was grinding back into motion, because that's what it does. It keeps moving, no matter what. 4 hours and 22 minutes. Remember that promise Ron made to himself about the kind of director he wanted to be? This is where it gets tested. "I'm going to be honest with you," Ron said to Diego. "I need this shot. The studio needs this shot. If we don't get it today, we lose this location, and the whole production gets thrown into chaos." He paused, making sure Diego was really listening. But I'm not going to ask you to do something you're not comfortable with. If you need more time, if you want Jack to run through the setup again, if you want to walk away and we'll figure something else out, you tell me, right now. And I promise you, there will be no consequences. Diego looked at Ron for a long moment. Then he looked up at the platform, then back at Ron. You mean that? I mean it, even if it costs us the location? Even then. Notice what happened in that moment. Diego's shoulders dropped about half an inch, a release of tension that Ron hadn't even realized was there. The stunt performer had been holding himself rigid, bracing for pressure that never came. He'd been expecting Ron to push, to remind him of the deadline, to make him feel like the entire production was resting on his shoulders. And when that pressure didn't come, something shifted. "Give me 10 minutes, Diego said. I want to walk through it one more time with Jack, slowly. Every step." Ron nodded. "Take 20 if you need it. We're not starting until you say you're ready." The crew stood down. Some of them looked confused. They could all see the clock, could all feel the deadline pressing down on them. Daniel Morrison was pacing near the monitors, his phone pressed to his ear, probably explaining to someone at the studio why they weren't shooting yet. But Ron didn't care about Daniel's phone calls. He cared about the man who was about to fall 15 feet, and trust that this time, the pads would be where they were supposed to be. Before we continue, I need you to understand something about film sets that most people never see. There's a hierarchy, a chain of command, and at the top of that chain, the director is supposed to be focused on the creative vision, the story, the performances, the way the light falls on an actor's face, the practical stuff, the safety stuff, the logistics that's supposed to be handled by other people, department heads, coordinators, producers. A director who gets too involved in the details is often seen as someone who doesn't trust their team. But Ron had learned something over the years that not every director learns. Sometimes the details are the story. Sometimes the way you treat a stunt performer who just watched his colleague get hurt says more about who you are than any shot you'll ever put on screen. Diego and Jack walked through the stunt 3 times, slowly, methodically. They checked every anchor point, every guide wire, every square inch of the crash pads. They discussed wind currents in the warehouse, the way the air moved differently when all the lights were on versus when they were off, the subtle pressure changes that could affect a falling body's trajectory. They talked about body position, arm placement, the exact angle Diego needed to achieve to land safely in the center of the pads. Jack made Diego practice his launch position 6 times without actually falling, just stepping to the edge and holding the stance. And then finally, when they were both satisfied, Diego walked up to Ron and said 4 words, "I'm ready. Let's go." 3 hours and 51 minutes until the deadline. Listen to what happened next, because this is the moment that everyone on that set would remember for the rest of their careers. Diego climbed the metal staircase to the platform. He positioned himself on the edge, 15 feet above the crash pads, that were now exactly where they needed to be. Jack Riley stood at the base, watching with the focus of a man whose entire professional reputation depended on what happened in the next 10 seconds. And Ron called action. Diego fell. The warehouse went silent, except for the rush of air, and the creak of the platform, and the collective held breath of 87 people who all knew what had happened the last time someone fell from that height. Time stretched the way it always does in moments like this, each second lasting an eternity, each heartbeat a lifetime. And then Diego hit the crash pads with a soft, controlled thud, exactly center, exactly where he was supposed to be, exactly the way it was designed to work. He bounced once, rolled onto his back, and gave a thumbs up to the crew. The applause started somewhere near the camera department and spread through the entire warehouse like a wave breaking against rocks. 87 people cheering for a fall that lasted less than 3 seconds. Ron felt something loosen in his chest, that he hadn't even realized was tight. They had the shot. Diego was safe. The production could continue. But wait, because the story doesn't end with that fall. What Ron did in the hours after is the part that actually mattered. They got the rest of the shots they needed. They made the deadline with 43 minutes to spare. The crew broke down the set and loaded the trucks and headed back to the main production office, exhausted but relieved. And Ron drove to the hospital. Marcus was awake when Ron arrived. His arm was in a cast, his shoulder was immobilized, and his face was pale from the pain medication, but he was awake. His wife was sitting beside the bed, holding his uninjured hand, looking at Ron with an expression that was so difficult to read. Was it anger, gratitude, exhaustion, maybe all three? "How's the movie?" Marcus asked. His voice was hoarse, but there was something like humor in it. "Did you get the shot?" Ron pulled a chair up to the bed and sat down. "We got it. Diego did the fall. It looked good." He paused. "But that's not why I'm here." Marcus waited. His wife waited. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft beep of monitors and the distant sound of nurses in the hallway. "I signed off on you doing that stunt," Ron said. "I watched the rehearsals. I saw how prepared you were, and I made the call to let you do it instead of Diego. That was my decision, and I need you to know that I'm sorry." Remember the 3 questions I opened at the beginning of this story? Now watch how they close, one by one, in reverse order. The 3rd question was about whether Ron would prioritize the schedule over his people. The answer came in those 20 minutes he gave Diego to walk through the stunt again. He could have pushed. He could have reminded everyone about the deadline, about the money, about the studio executives waiting for updates. Instead, he created space. He let a professional do his job at his own pace. And in doing so, he showed everyone on that set that safety wasn't just a line item on a production report, it was the foundation everything else was built on. The 2nd question was about what went wrong with the guide wire. The investigation took weeks, but eventually they traced it back to a simple mechanical failure, a bolt that had been slowly loosening over multiple rehearsals, finally giving way at exactly the wrong moment. No one was blamed, no one was fired, but procedures were changed. Every guide wire on every future Ron Howard production would be checked between rehearsal and take, every single time, no exceptions. One accident became a policy that would protect hundreds of performers for years to come. The 1st question was about why Marcus missed the crash pads, and the answer in the end wasn't about equipment or physics, or even bad luck. It was about a system that sometimes fails, despite everyone's best efforts. Marcus Chen had done everything right. Jack Riley had done everything right. The crew had done everything right. And still, a man ended up in the hospital with a broken arm and a bruised shoulder and a career that would never quite look the same. That's the reality of filmmaking that most people never see. Sometimes you do everything right and things still go wrong. The question isn't whether you can prevent every accident. You can't. The question is what you do when accidents happen. Marcus was out for 6 weeks. The production worked around his absence, rescheduling scenes, bringing in a hand double for certain shots, adjusting the edit to minimize the impact. When Marcus finally returned, there was a moment on set that no one had planned. The crew stopped what they were doing and applauded. Not because it was in the schedule, not because anyone told them to, but because they wanted him to know that he was more than just an actor who had fallen off a platform. He was part of their team, and the team was glad to have him back. And Ron Howard? He kept directing, he kept making films, he kept showing up on sets, and in editing rooms, and at production meetings, doing the work he'd been doing for decades. But something had changed after that day in the warehouse. He started asking different questions during stunt meetings. He started building more time into schedules for safety rehearsals. He started treating every performer, actor or stunt double, as someone whose well-being was his personal responsibility. Not because it was required, Not because it looked good, but because he'd knelt beside a man on a concrete floor and looked into his eyes and understood, in a way he never had before, what it really meant to be in charge. Notice how this story isn't really about a stunt gone wrong. It's about what happens in the spaces between the dramatic moments. The 20 minutes of patience, the hospital visit nobody required, the policy change nobody demanded. That's where character lives. That's where leadership reveals itself. Not in the big decisions that everyone sees, but in the small ones that most people forget. Here's the final question I want to leave you with. What would you have done in that warehouse? When you had a deadline breathing down your neck, and a stunt performer looking to you for guidance and a crew waiting to see what kind of leader you really were, what call would you have made? It's easy to say you'd prioritize safety. It's easy to say you'd give Diego all the time he needed. But in the moment, with millions of dollars on the line, and executives on the phone, and everyone watching to see if you'd blink, in that moment, the right choice isn't always the obvious choice. Ron Howard made the hard choice that day. He made it quietly, without drama, in a way that most people outside that warehouse would never even know about. That's the story of Stage 7. The day a guide wire slipped, and a man fell, and a director discovered something about himself that he'd always hoped was true. It's not a story about Hollywood, or stunts, or the price of making movies. It's a story about what happens when someone in power decides that people matter more than schedules. If this meant something to you, tell me in the comments below. And if you want to hear what happened the night a test screening went so wrong that Ron almost walked away from the film entirely, let me know. That story's been waiting to be told.